Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. My name is Eve, and at my husband's funeral, my only son struck me across the face and told me I had no home. His wife whispered it was their forever home, as if my decades of sacrifice never existed. They locked me out, but what they forgot was my name was still on the deed. 31 days later, a foreclosure letter arrived, and their forever ended while my true peace finally began. The lilies on the altar had already begun to wilt their scent thick in the small church in Anchorage, where we gathered for Tom's funeral. I stood near the casket, my hands gripping the edge, staring at the polished wood that held the body of the man I had loved for 40 years. The air was heavy, filled with the low murmur of relatives and neighbors, the scrape of chairs, the occasional cough. My chest ached from holding in sobs I could not allow to escape. I told myself I would stay strong, at least until the service ended. I felt Drew's presence before I saw him. My son, my only child, stood a few feet away, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight. I turned, expecting to see grief on his face, perhaps the shadow of his father's features softened by sorrow. Instead, I saw anger sharp and burning. He stepped closer, his hand rising so fast I did not even flinch before it landed. The sound of his palm against my cheek cracked through the room like wood snapping in a fire. My head jerked to the side. My skin stung, but the wound went deeper. His voice followed, cold and sharp. "This isn't your home anymore. Get out." For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The whispers behind me hushed. My hand rose to my cheek without my permission, trembling against the warmth where his fingers had struck. I looked at him, searching for some sign this was a mistake, that grief had twisted his tongue. But his eyes, the same blue as Tom's, held no regret. Behind him stood Lena. She crossed her arms, chin lifted, a small smirk curling on her lips. She leaned close enough for only me to hear, though I caught the glint in her eyes that told me she wanted me to see her victory. "Finally, our forever home," she whispered. The words sliced sharper than Drew's slap. Forever home. The house Tom and I had built together in 1990 with borrowed money and long nights of work. The place where Drew had taken his first steps on the worn hardwood floors, where Tom had patched the roof during long Alaskan winters, where I had scrubbed the kitchen tiles until my knees ached. Our forever home, she called it, as if my years had never mattered. I swallowed hard, the taste of iron in my mouth. I wanted to scream to remind Drew of the nights I stayed awake counting pennies for his school supplies, of the double shifts I worked when Tom's auto shop failed, of the Christmases when I wrapped second-hand toys so he would not notice the sacrifices. Instead, I stood frozen, my hand pressed to my cheek, the humiliation flooding me hotter than the pain. Aunt Ruth, Tom's sister, shifted uneasily in the pew, her eyes flicking from Drew to me, but she said nothing. The other relatives avoided my gaze. Silence filled the space where support should have been. Only one figure standing near the back held my stare. Jack Wilson, our neighbor and the president of the HOA, frowned as he witnessed the scene. His mouth opened slightly as if to object, but he closed it again, uncertain. Drew's voice broke the silence once more, lower this time, but just as cutting. I said it clearly. "Get out." My breath caught in my chest. I looked at my son, the boy I had carried in my arms when he cried over broken toys, the young man I had defended before his high school principal when he was wrongly accused of cheating the father who once called me for advice when his newborn kept him awake through the night. Now he was a stranger, his face hard, his heart closed. I steadied myself, planting both feet firmly on the ground. My eyes locked with his. He could not hold my gaze for long. He turned slightly, his shoulders shifting as if he feared what he saw in me. I felt the weight of years settle into my spine, not crushing me, but giving me strength. I was not just a grieving widow. I was not just a mother cast aside. I was something steadier, older, something he had underestimated. The church bells outside told the hour, the sound muffled through the walls. No one moved. No one dared speak. My cheeks still burned, my heart bruised deeper than flesh, but I refused to break in front of them. I reached for the small black purse at my side, the one I had carried since Tom's hospital stay. Inside it lay the key to a safe deposit box, a folder of documents, and a recorder I had started using years ago after Tom's first stroke to capture important details the doctors told me. It was habit now to keep it close. My fingers brushed against it, and I drew in a breath, steadying myself. I turned back to the casket, to Tom's still face framed by fading flowers. His hands folded over his chest bore the calluses of decades of work. I whispered so softly only I could hear. "You knew, didn't you? You always knew." The hush of the room pressed against me, thick with judgment and disbelief. Drew shifted restless, but did not speak again. Lena's smirk lingered, cruel and triumphant. My eyes burned, but I would not let the tears fall. Not here, not now. I lifted my suitcase from the corner near the pew. It was still half packed from the hospital days when I thought I would bring Tom home again. The weight of it dragged at my arm, but I pulled it upright with quiet determination. My shoes clicked softly on the church floor as I turned toward the door. No one moved to stop me, not even Drew. The cold Alaskan air rushed against my face as I stepped outside. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the gray sky, catching in my hair and on the black fabric of my coat. I let them cling, not brushing them away. The chill was kinder than my son's hand had been. At the corner of the church lot, I paused. Across the street, Jack Wilson stood by his truck, his face pale, his brows drawn together. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, giving me only a nod. I returned it, the gesture small but enough. He had seen. That mattered more than words. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle, my cheek still burning, my heart heavier than the sky above me. The church bells faded into silence, leaving only the crunch of snow under my boots as I walked away. I dragged the suitcase down the short front walk, each wheel bumping against the cracks Tom had promised to patch before winter. My breath puffed white in the cold Anchorage air, and the sky hung heavy with snow that threatened to fall harder. Behind me, the door closed with a dull thud. A moment later, I heard the metallic grind of tools and the low voice of a locksmith called by Lena. The sharp sound of screws being removed echoed like nails in a coffin. I stopped at the edge of the yard, my eyes resting on the weathered wooden fence Tom and I had built the summer of 1993. I remembered him lifting the posts into place, while I held them steady, our hands, dirty, our laughter loud in the long Alaskan twilight. I looked at the small rose bush planted near the gate, now brittle and bare from frost. We had put it in the ground on our 20th anniversary, kneeling side by side, our fingers pressed into the soil. Those moments seemed carved into the land itself, yet now they belonged to someone else's story. A voice carried from the porch. It was Lena speaking with Mrs. Harkins, a neighbor from across the street. The words pierced the cold air. "We finally have our forever home." I froze, my chest tightening. The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel refrain. Forever home. The house where I raised my son, where I nursed Tom back to health after his first heart scare, where I prayed at the kitchen table during long nights of worry. Now the words were tossed casually from Lena's mouth as if I had never existed. Mrs. Harkins murmured something polite in reply, but I could feel her eyes on me as I stood there gripping the suitcase handle. I turned quickly, unwilling to let them see the tears gathering in my eyes. The driveway stretched before me, the familiar slope leading to the old car Tom and I had paid off years ago. Its windows were frosted, the kind of thin ice that breaks apart in delicate patterns when touched. I walked past it, my boots crunching on the frozen gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself wanted to hold me there. I reached the street corner, my body trembling from more than the cold. Jack Wilson's truck was parked a few houses down. He stood beside it, his arms folded, his expression troubled. He took a step forward as if he might say something, but then stopped. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me a small nod, the kind that says, "I saw and I know." It was a shred of acknowledgement in a day that had stripped me bare. I returned the nod, then kept walking. At the gas station near the main road, I stopped to catch my breath. The bench outside was covered in a thin layer of snow, but I sat anyway, the suitcase beside me. My face still burned from Drew's hand. Inside the station, a teenage clerk glanced out, recognition flickering in his eyes. He came outside, shifting awkwardly in the cold. "Are you all right, Mrs. Carter?" he asked softly. I forced a smile, my voice steady though hollow. "I am fine. Just waiting for a ride." He offered to let me sit inside where it was warm, but I shook my head. The air, as bitter as it was, kept me grounded. When the cab arrived, I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver the address of a small apartment-style motel near Spennard Road. The driver, a man with a lined face and kind eyes, glanced at me in the mirror but asked no questions. The hum of the engine filled the silence as we passed streets I had known for decades. Houses strung with holiday lights blurred past the window, families gathering inside where warmth and laughter still lived. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, wishing I could slip back into that world. The motel was modest, a 2-story building painted in faded blue. The neon sign flickered, half the letters dim. I paid the driver with bills from my purse, my fingers stiff with cold. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her hair, looked up as I entered. She scanned my face but offered no questions, only a quiet understanding. "Do you need a room?" she asked. "Just for one," I said. She handed me a key card and slid a form across the counter. The room was small with beige walls and a thin carpet that smelled faintly of bleach. A heater rattled in the corner, filling the silence with its uneven hum. I set the suitcase near the bed and sat down, my body sinking into the mattress that sagged in the middle. The stillness pressed against me, the kind of quiet that does not comfort, but accuses. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the water stains that spread like branches of a tree. My hand drifted to my cheek where Drew had struck me, the skin still sore. I thought of Tom, how he would have risen from his chair, how he would have told Drew that respect for his mother was not optional. The ache of his absence weighed heavier than any bruise. I unpacked only what I needed: a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a small photo of Tom smiling in our garden. I placed the photo on the nightstand, leaning it against the lamp. His eyes seemed to meet mine, steady and warm. I whispered into the silence. "I tried, Tom. I tried so hard." The evening dragged on, the sound of cars passing outside, the occasional footsteps in the hall. I made tea with the small kettle provided, but the taste was bitter. I held the cup anyway, letting the heat warm my hands. Memories circled like restless birds. Drew as a boy running across the yard with a baseball glove. Drew as a teenager slamming doors during arguments. Drew as a man holding his newborn daughter and calling me for advice. And now Drew standing in a church beside his father's casket, striking me and claiming the home I had built. I lay down fully dressed, pulling the thin blanket to my chin. My mind replayed Lena's smirk, her words echoing again. Forever home. I closed my eyes, but the phrase would not leave me. The heater rattled on the walls, held their silence, and I realized this was the beginning of something I had not chosen, but could no longer avoid. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, gray and cold. I rose slowly, my body stiff, my spirit bruised, but not broken. Outside, the snow had deepened, covering the street in white. I stood at the window watching the flakes fall steady and unrelenting. Somewhere across town, Drew and Lena were already arranging their lives inside what they believed was their forever home. But I knew better. Forever has its own measure of time, and the story was not finished. The ceiling above me was stained with faint watermarks that spread out like branches of an old tree, and I traced them with tired eyes while the heater rattled in the corner of the motel room. The air was dry, smelling faintly of bleach and dust, and every creak of the pipes reminded me I was not at home, not anymore. My body ached from the cold night, but it was the silence that pressed heavier than any bruise. I could not stop thinking of Tom, of the years we had fought to keep that house standing, of all the nights I told myself it was worth the struggle. I remembered 2010 with painful clarity. Tom's auto repair shop had failed after years of trying to compete with bigger chains, and he carried the weight of that failure like it was nailed to his chest. I had come home from my shift at Anchorage Medical Clinic to find him sitting at the kitchen table, unpaid bills spread out in front of him, his hands buried in his hair. That was the year we refinanced the mortgage, the year I signed my name again to save the house. I still remember the bank officer sliding the papers across the desk, her voice brisk as she explained the terms. Tom's credit had been ruined, but mine was clean steady. It was my name that kept the house afloat. I had taken on double shifts after that, working nights at the clinic, then picking up extra hours cleaning offices when I could. There were evenings when I would come home so late, the sky was already lightening with dawn, and Tom would still be awake, ashamed, waiting for me with a pot of coffee. I told him not to blame himself, but I could see the way his shoulders slumped a little more each year. I hid my cracked knuckles under gloves, told Drew I was just tired from age. I never let him see how much it cost me to keep the roof over his head. The heater in the motel groaned and clicked, pulling me back to the present. I rolled to my side, staring at the suitcase on the floor. Inside, beneath folded clothes, was a small envelope, the one Tom had given me 2 years before he died. He had handed it to me in the bedroom one quiet afternoon in 2020. His health had already begun to falter, his skin pale, his body thin, but his eyes burned with a sharpness that startled me. He pressed the envelope into my hand and said, "Open this only if Andrew ever hurts you." His voice cracked on the word hurt. I had laughed it off at the time, told him he was being dramatic, that our son was just under stress. But Tom shook his head. He had seen the way Drew spoke to me when he thought no one was listening, the way Lena's eyes rolled when I entered a room. He whispered that he did not trust them to treat me kindly once he was gone. I tucked the envelope away in the drawer beside the bed and prayed I would never have reason to open it. Now the memory of his hand in mine that day filled the room as sharply as the cold. I closed my eyes and saw him sitting against the pillows, his breath shallow, but his gaze steady. His voice had been low, almost broken, but I remember every word. "Not unless he hurts you." He knew. Somehow, he always knew. I sat up and swung my legs off the bed, the floor cold beneath my feet. The envelope was still in the suitcase, untouched, waiting. I did not open it. Not yet. I ran my fingers over the worn leather handle of the case and whispered to myself, I have been silent my whole life, but silence does not mean surrender. It means I have been waiting. The words hung in the room like smoke. My chest rose and fell with a sharp breath, and I felt something stir inside me, not rage exactly, but a steady kind of resolve. For years, I had kept the family together, had chosen peace over conflict, had endured Lena's cutting remarks and Drew's growing distance. I told myself it was for the sake of harmony for Tom, for the grandchildren I hoped to hold one day. But now harmony had been broken with a slap, with a cruel sentence spoken at his father's funeral. I walked to the window, pulling the thin curtain aside. Snow still fell over Anchorage, blanketing the street below in quiet white. Cars moved slowly, headlights cutting through the gray morning. People were going about their lives, buying groceries, filling gas tanks, walking dogs. Ordinary lives continuing while mine had been torn open in the span of a few hours. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, the sting clearing my thoughts. Somewhere across town, Drew and Lena were likely arranging furniture, hanging new curtains, taking ownership of the house as though I had never existed. I imagined Lena smiling, posting pictures on her phone, captioning them with words like fresh start or forever home. I let the thought pass through me without flinching. Forever home is not decided by captions or paint on the walls. It is decided by names on deeds, by signatures inked onto contracts, by sacrifices written into the very bones of the house. My reflection in the glass looked older than I felt inside. Long hours of work. Touched my cheek with instinct and calm linger there. I thought of the nights I stayed quiet so Tom could sleep, the days I swallowed my pride so Drew could stand tall. Silence had been my companion for decades, but now it would be my weapon. I closed the curtain and returned to the bed, pulling the envelope from the suitcase and holding it between my hands. I did not open it, but I could feel the weight of what it held, the preparation of a man who had always known I might one day need it. My fingers traced the edges until the skin of my thumb grew warm from the friction. I placed it gently back into the case, zipped it shut, and sat for a long time listening to the heater's uneven hum. When the sound finally lulled into a steady rhythm, I lay back down, my eyes fixed once again on the water-stained ceiling. The branches above me seemed less like scars and more like roots now, spreading outward, connecting me to something deeper. I breathed in slowly, the resolve settling into my chest like a quiet flame. My silence was no longer just a shield. It was a beginning. Morning light seeped through the thin motel curtains, a dull gray that made the room feel colder than it already was. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase and the envelope inside it, knowing what I had to do. My hand shook slightly as I reached for my coat. The air outside bit into my skin as I walked to the street, pulling my scarf tight around my neck. Anchorage streets were slick with ice cars moving cautiously, drivers hunched forward, with both hands gripping the wheel. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of Northern Pine Bank. My voice was steady, but inside I felt the ground shifting. The bank sat on a corner downtown, a square building of glass and steel that looked colder than the weather itself. I had been there many times over the years, paying bills, depositing checks, sitting across from loan officers who barely looked me in the eye while I signed away pieces of my life. This time felt different. I stepped inside, the warm air hitting me, the faint scent of coffee and printer ink filling my nose. A young clerk at the counter looked up. She had short brown hair tucked behind her ears and a name tag that read Mel Grant. She could not have been older than 22. Her smile was polite, practiced, but when I asked about accessing my safe deposit box, her eyes softened just a little, as if she understood without me saying more. "Of course, ma'am," she said. "May I see your ID?" I handed her my driver's license with trembling fingers. She verified it quickly and returned it, then led me down a narrow hallway to a quiet room at the back. The sound of footsteps and muffled voices faded as we entered. The walls were plain beige, almost bare, except for a small clock ticking above the door. Mel handed me a key and placed another into the lock. Together the mechanism clicked and the box slid free with a dull scrape of metal on metal. I sat at the small table, my hands resting on the cool steel of the box, before I lifted the lid. Inside lay the folder I had not touched since placing it there. The sight of it brought a rush of memories, Tom's voice whispering in my ear that day in 2020, his frail hand gripping mine. I pulled the folder out carefully, laying it flat on the table. My breath caught as I opened it. On top lay a letter in Tom's handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the words were clear and strong. To my dearest Eve, it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. And if you are reading this because Drew did what I prayed he never would, then I am sorry. But you must remember you are not powerless. This house was yours as much as mine. Your hands built it, your sacrifices paid for it. No one, not even our son, can take that truth from you." Beneath the letter, his signature stood bold, dated October 2020. My eyes blurred, and I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the weight of his love and his foresight. Beneath the letter lay the supplemental will notarized and signed, the clause that would change everything. Clause 17B, written in precise legal language, stated that if Andrew Carter ever verbally abused, physically harmed, or attempted to evict his mother, Eve Carter, from the family home, he forfeited all inheritance rights. The estate would transfer entirely under her control through a designated trust. It was all there in black and white, stamped and witnessed. My hands shook as I traced the embossed seal, a mixture of sorrow and relief flooding me. At the bottom of the folder was a small USB drive labeled in Tom's handwriting, "Mortgage documents." I remembered how careful he had been scanning every payment slip, every contract, every statement. He had been meticulous, never careless. He knew one day the papers might speak louder than any voice. I sat there for a long time, the clock ticking on the wall, my heart heavy but steady. Tom had seen this coming. He had worried not about death, but about what would come after, about me left behind with a son who had forgotten where he came from. My tears finally fell, quiet drops that darkened the paper beneath my fingers. I let them fall. They were not weakness. They were acknowledgement of all that had been lost and all that had been prepared for me to carry forward. When I finally lifted my head, Mel knocked gently on the door. "Everything all right, ma'am?" she asked softly. I folded the documents back into the folder, closed the box, and nodded. "Yes, everything is all right." For the first time in days, the words felt almost true. I placed the folder back into the safe deposit box, but I kept the USB drive in my purse, slipping it into the pocket where I could feel its weight against me. I would need it soon, though I did not yet know exactly how. Mel locked the box away again and smiled faintly as she led me back through the hall. "Have a good day," she said, and I nodded, though my day had already shifted into something entirely different. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the streets wet and gleaming under the pale light. I pulled my coat tight and walked slowly down the sidewalk. The city moved around me, people carrying coffee cups, children holding hands with their parents, traffic rumbling at the intersection. All of it felt distant. What I carried in my purse was heavier than any stone, more powerful than any weapon. I paused at a bench near the bus stop and sat down, pulling out the letter again. My eyes traced Tom's handwriting, the steady strokes of a man who had known me better than anyone. "You are not powerless." The words repeated in my mind like a drumbeat. My chest rose with a deep breath, my hands no longer trembling. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the folder. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cold air and pine from the mountains. I looked toward the horizon where the peaks were dusted white, unshakable, ancient. Tom had built protections for me as solid as those mountains, and now they were mine to use. I stood and began walking back toward the motel, my purse heavier on my shoulder, but my steps firmer on the icy pavement. The silence inside me had shifted. It was no longer just the absence of words. It was preparation, steady and deliberate. I did not yet know exactly what I would do with the power Tom had left me, but I knew one thing with certainty. The story was no longer theirs to write. It was mine. The next morning I woke with a sense of purpose that felt strange in its steadiness. The air in the motel room was heavy and stale, but my mind was clear. I dressed carefully, pulling on my black coat, smoothing my scarf, brushing my hair until it lay flat against my shoulders. I placed the USB drive from Tom into my purse, its weight grounding me. When the cab dropped me outside Northern Pine Bank again, the building looked less like a fortress and more like a place waiting for me. Inside the lobby buzzed with the sound of phones and printers, but I walked straight to the reception desk. The clerk from the day before Mel greeted me politely and asked if I needed the deposit box again. "Not today," I said. "I need to speak with a loan officer." She pointed me toward a row of glass offices along the far wall. A woman stepped out as I approached, her dark hair tied neatly back her blazer, fitted her smile professional, but not unkind. Jess Park, her name tag read. She looked to be in her late 20s, her voice brisk but gentle as she asked how she could help me. I told her I needed to discuss the mortgage on the Carter residence. Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she gestured for me to follow her into her office. The room was small, lined with filing cabinets and a desk with dual monitors glowing with spreadsheets. Jess offered me a seat, then sat across from me, folding her hands. "May I see your identification?" she asked. I handed over my license, my fingers steady now. She typed quickly, searching the account, then nodded as the file appeared on her screen. "Yes, here it is. The mortgage for 1427 Turnagain Drive." She paused, scanning. "Co-borrowers Thomas Carter and Eve Carter. That is you." Hearing my name spoken aloud in that office was like a door opening. "Yes," I said. "That is me. I would like to stop the automatic payments on the account effective immediately." Jess's eyes flickered not with doubt, but with the formality of her role. She leaned slightly forward. "Mrs. Carter, are you aware of the implications of suspending automatic payments?" I nodded. "Yes, I am fully aware. I want to proceed." She tapped a few keys, her voice calm as she explained. "If we stop the autopay today, the next scheduled payment will not be withdrawn. After 31 days of non-payment, the account will be considered in default. At that point, the bank will issue a default notice to the primary address on file. After that notice is sent, there is typically a 15-day cure period. If no payment is made within that window, foreclosure proceedings may begin. I listened carefully, my hands resting in my lap. The words sounded clinical, but to me they rang like church bells. Default, notice, cure period, foreclosure. Each step laid out like rungs on a ladder I was meant to climb. Jess continued, her eyes meeting mine. Because you are a co-borrower, no changes or modifications to the loan can be made without your consent. That includes refinancing extensions or reinstating automatic payments. Your signature is required. My breath came slower, deeper. That was the line I had been waiting for. I thought of Drew and Lena sitting smugly in the house, calling it theirs, posting pictures, changing locks. They had forgotten whose name still lived in the paperwork. They had mistaken silence for absence. I asked if I could have a copy of the original loan file. Jess excused herself briefly and returned with a thick folder, my name typed neatly on the tab. She slid it across the desk to me. These are copies of all agreements, including the refinance from 2010, she said. You are listed as co-borrower and co-owner on every page. I placed my hand on the folder, feeling the weight of it. 32 years of sacrifice distilled into paper and ink. I opened it briefly, scanning the familiar signatures, the embossed seals, the dates. My name, my handwriting steady even when my life had been anything but. Jess handed me a form to sign, authorizing the suspension of automatic payments. The pen felt firm in my grip as I wrote my name once again. It took less than a minute, but the sound of the pen scratching across the paper seemed louder than anything else in the room. When I finished, Jess reviewed the document and placed it into the file. She looked at me with a flicker of respect in her eyes, as if she understood more than she could say. Is there anything else I can do for you today, Mrs. Carter? I shook my head. No. You have done enough. As I stood sliding the folder into my purse, I felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because I was no longer carrying it in silence. Outside, the air was sharp and clear, the snow packed down on the sidewalks into glittering ice. I walked slowly, carefully, each step deliberate. My purse pressed against my side, filled with papers that were no longer just documents. They were proof. They were power. I passed a cafe with fogged windows, couples inside leaning over steaming mugs. For a moment I thought of Tom, how he loved to sit with me in little places like that, his hand warm over mine. I whispered his name under my breath and felt him near, not as memory, but as presence. He had trusted me to carry this weight, and now I was carrying it with purpose. By the time I reached the motel, the gray sky had begun to clear. Sunlight broke through thin but steady glinting off the snowbanks. I climbed the stairs to my room, unlocked the door, and set the folder on the bed. I stared at it for a long moment, then sat beside it, running my hand over the cover. I thought of Drew's voice cold in the church. This is not your home anymore. I thought of Lena's smirk as she whispered forever home. I thought of Tom's careful preparations, the letter, the will, the trust he placed in me. My lips curved into the smallest of smiles, faint but unshakable. For the first time since the funeral, I knew I was not powerless. I knew the next move was mine. I carried the folder back with me to the motel and set it carefully on the small desk by the window. The heater rattled and the air smelled faintly of bleach, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I stared at the stack of papers that proved what Tom had always known and what Drew had chosen to forget. For the first time in days, I felt something more than grief. I felt steady, almost unshakable. I made tea from the small kettle in the room, letting the steam curl around my face as I considered the weight of what I now held. Late that evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily Jack Wilson's granddaughter. She had always been friendly sometimes, dropping off cookies during Christmas, her hair tied in messy braids as she told me about school. The message was short but sharp. "Mrs. Carter, I think you should see what they're posting." I frowned, my heart tightening before I even unlocked the phone. The screen lit up with images that made my breath catch. The first photo was of the living room stripped of the familiar wood paneling Tom had put up himself and repainted in cream. A new chandelier hung in place of the ceiling fan we had picked out together at a yard sale in 1998. The caption written in Lena's practiced hand was bright and cruel in its simplicity. "Goodbye, darkness. Hello, forever home." My fingers tightened around the phone until my knuckles whitened. I scrolled further. Another picture showed the kitchen. The oak cabinets Tom had built when Drew was still a boy were gone, replaced with glossy white panels and shining marble counters. Wine glasses sparkled under the lights, bottles open, laughter frozen in the image. Lena stood at the center in a red sweater, her smile triumphant, a glass of champagne in hand. Drew had his arm wrapped around her waist, his smile wide but hollow, his eyes avoiding the camera just slightly. Behind them, friends clinked glasses, leaning over the dining table that Tom had sanded smooth every spring. There were more. A short looping video of Drew popping a cork champagne, spraying as guests laughed. Another of Lena holding paint swatches, her caption littered with hashtags about fresh starts and their dream house. A group shot with neighbors gathered around the fireplace, where I had once hung stockings for Drew on Christmas Eve, now decorated in Lena's golden white theme. Every image was a blade cutting deeper. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat as I studied their faces. They were celebrating. They were erasing me with every laugh. Every caption, every carefully staged corner of the house that had cost me decades of labor and sacrifice. Forever home, she called it, smiling into a camera as if history had never happened. My mind drifted back to the nights Tom and I had eaten soup for dinner because the mortgage came first, to the years I scrubbed floors and filed charts at the clinic long past midnight so Drew could have new shoes for school, to the snowstorms when Tom and I patched the roof ourselves with nothing but tar paper and prayers. Each memory rose up against the glossy images on the screen louder and stronger. My hand trembled, but I would not look away. I forced myself to see every photo, to remember every insult tucked into their captions. They had convinced themselves I was gone, a shadow erased with fresh paint. My name might have been silenced in their mouths, but it lived on those documents now, sitting inches away from me. I set the phone down face first on the table, pressing my palms flat against the wood until I felt steady again. The heat in my chest shifted, not the frantic rage that would pass, but a heavier fire, controlled and deliberate. They thought the story ended when I walked out of that church with a suitcase. They had no idea it was only beginning. I picked up Tom's letter again, unfolding the creased paper, tracing the words he had written with such care. "You are not powerless." The line repeated in my head as I glanced once more at the glowing screen of the phone. Lena could write forever, as many times as she liked. She could paint the walls, replace the cabinets, throw parties with champagne. None of it changed the truth. Forever did not belong to her. Forever belonged to me, the one who had paid for every brick, who had kept every receipt, who still held every legal string. The clock on the nightstand ticked softly each second, marking the widening distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. I lifted the phone again, staring at the smiling faces in the photos. I whispered into the quiet room, "Enjoy it while you can." Snow began to fall again outside the motel window, drifting in soft spirals under the streetlight. I watched the flakes land against the glass, melting slowly before vanishing. The world carried on cars passing people bundled in coats hurrying through the night. Inside my room, I stood still, a woman stripped of her place, but not her power. I walked to the desk, unzipped the folder, and laid out the documents one by one. The original mortgage, the refinance papers, the supplemental will, the clause that bore Drew's name like a warning. I placed Tom's letter on top, smoothing the edges with my palm. My phone buzzed again with another post, but I did not rush to check it. I already knew what it would say. More paint, more laughter, more claims of forever. I stared at the neat black ink of my signature on the deed, the co-borrower line filled with my name, my steady handwriting that had held even when my life was falling apart. My lips curved into a faint smile. They believed my silence meant absence, but they were wrong. Silence was not absence. Silence was preparation. I returned the papers to the folder and slipped it back into my purse. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, the heater humming in the corner. I lay on the bed, my body heavy but my mind alert, replaying the images of Lena's smug smile, Drew's arm around her waist, their friends raising glasses in the home I had built. The words "forever home" still rang in my ears, sharp and relentless. But under the noise of their celebrations, I heard something else. Tom's voice steady and certain, reminding me that the story was not over. I closed my eyes, my hand resting on the purse that held the proof of everything. I breathed deeply, letting the weight of the night settle into me. They had declared forever, but forever would answer to me. The night inside the motel pressed heavy on me, the heater rattling in the corner as if it too was struggling to keep up. I sat on the bed staring at the phone on the nightstand, its black screen reflecting a faint outline of my face. My hand moved almost on its own to the coat I had draped over the chair earlier. I slipped my fingers into the deep inner pocket and touched something small and hard. The recorder. It had been with me for years, ever since Tom's first stroke when the doctor's instructions blurred together faster than I could remember. I carried it for practical reasons to capture medication lists, appointments, even grocery reminders. That morning at the funeral, I had slipped it into my coat out of habit, never once thinking it might record the worst moment of my life. I drew it out, turning it over in my hand. The plastic was worn smooth from use, the play button dulled. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Then I pressed the button. At first there was only muffled sound, the shuffle of people moving, the low hum of voices echoing in the church. Then Drew's voice tore through the quiet. "This isn't your home anymore. Get out." The slap followed. Loud, brutal, undeniable. My own sharp gasp echoed faintly a sound I hadn't realized I'd made at the time. Then Lena's voice slid into the silence, triumphant and cruel. Finally, our forever home. The motel walls seemed to close in on me. My chest constricted, my cheek burned as if struck all over again. But I didn't stop the recording. I let it play until the room filled with silence once more. I rewound it and pressed play again. This time, I listened differently. Not as a mother wounded, but as a woman holding proof. Every syllable, every tone, every cruel word was evidence. The recorder had captured not only their betrayal, but their arrogance. They thought I had walked out powerless. They had forgotten the habits I carried, the quiet preparations I made. My voice broke the silence, barely more than a whisper. I am not speaking to ask permission anymore. I am speaking so the truth can stand. The words steadied me. I replayed the file one more time, each detail embedding itself into my memory. Drew's fury, Lena's smirk, the slap ringing in the air. This was not just pain now. This was armor. I set the recorder gently on the desk and opened the purse that held Tom's folder. The USB drive gleamed faintly under the lamp. Mortgage documents, the supplemental will, the clause he had insisted upon. I placed the recorder beside them. Papers and voices. Together they formed a wall stronger than anything Drew or Lena could build. The sky outside shifted toward dawn before I finally closed my eyes. Even in sleep I heard echoes, but now they no longer crushed me. They reminded me. By morning the snow had stopped. The streets of Anchorage were quiet cars rolling slowly over frozen slush. I walked to a diner near the motel, the kind with cracked vinyl booths, and a waitress who called everyone honey. I ordered coffee, its warmth seeping into my palms, and pulled out my laptop. I connected the recorder with the small cable I always kept. The file appeared instantly, the name a jumble of numbers and letters, but I knew exactly what it held. I saved it under a new name, one that carried weight. Funeral proof. My fingers shook for only a moment before I attached it to an email. The address I typed belonged to Megan Dale. She had been Tom's attorney for years, sharp and steady with eyes that never wavered. We had trusted her to draft the supplemental will to safeguard the details Tom worried I would need one day. She had told us to call her if anything ever went wrong. I never thought I would have to. Subject line urgent. Clause 17B. I attached the recording, the scanned mortgage file, the will, and Tom's letter. In the body of the message, I typed only a few words. Megan, it is time. Please review and advise. Eve Carter. I hovered for a long moment before pressing send. The sound of the email leaving was small, but to me it was thunder. The truth was no longer mine alone. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the booth. The waitress topped off my cup without asking her kindness, a soft reminder that not all the world had turned cold. I sipped slowly, staring out at the snow-covered street, watching children pull sleds while parents tugged grocery bags. Life moved forward outside. Inside me, something shifted too. I returned to the motel and set the recorder back on the nightstand. I touched it once before closing the drawer as if sealing away the moment until it would be needed. The room felt less like a prison now and more like a waiting room. The heater hummed, the light faded into evening, and I sat steady, my hands folded in my lap. Across town, I imagined Drew and Lena clinking glasses under their new chandelier, laughing with friends, posting more pictures to prove their victory. They were so certain of their forever home, so sure I had vanished. I reached for Tom's letter again, unfolding it carefully, the ink steady and clear. You are not powerless. The line burned into me. I pressed the page against my chest and whispered to the empty room. I did not choose this fight, but I will not walk away. Not this time. The night stretched on, but I did not feel crushed. The silence felt different now. It no longer smothered me. It sharpened me. With every beat of my heart, I knew the proof was waiting, and soon others would hear it. The truth had a voice, and it was ready. My laptop screen glowed in the dim motel room, the cursor blinking as if it too were holding its breath. I had pressed send only minutes earlier, but my chest already ached with the weight of waiting. The snow outside had slowed to a drift flake swirling beneath the streetlight. I pressed my palms flat on the table, steadying myself. Then the chime of an incoming message startled me so sharply I nearly dropped my cup of tea. Megan's name appeared bold at the top of the inbox. Her reply was not long, but it carried more strength than paragraphs ever could. Eve, I have reviewed the attachments. The supplemental will is valid. Clause 17B is enforceable under Alaska law. The recording is admissible. You did exactly what you needed to do. I will initiate a freeze on the estate assets immediately. Tomorrow we will discuss setting a family meeting. Stay strong. My hand trembled against the mouse pad as I read her words again. Tom's foresight, the clause, the recording, all of it had fused into a shield. For the first time since that day at the church, I no longer felt like a woman abandoned. I felt like a woman armed. I sat back in the chair, letting the hum of the heater fill the silence. My body was exhausted, but my mind pulsed with new clarity. I reached for Tom's letter again, running my fingers over the words I had memorized. You are not powerless. I whispered them aloud, and for the first time they did not feel like comfort alone. They felt like a command. A knock startled me from the quiet. 3 soft raps at the door. My breath caught as I stood. When I opened it, Pastor Miller stood in the hall, his old wool coat dusted with snow, his hat in his hand. His eyes, still sharp even at 68, studied my face with quiet concern. "Eve, may I come in?" he asked gently. I stepped aside, and he entered, the faint scent of pine clinging to his coat. He brushed snow from his shoulders and took my hands before I could speak. "I am so sorry for what you've endured." He set his voice deep with years of sermons and prayers. I heard whispers of what happened at the funeral. The words caught in my throat, but I forced them out. "He struck me, Pastor. My son. He struck me and told me I had no home." Pastor Miller's jaw tightened, but he did not let go of my hands. "God never abandons those who stand for truth," he said firmly. "You are not alone in this, even if you feel the walls have closed in." Tears stung my eyes, though they were not the tears of helplessness I had shed in the church. These were different, lighter somehow. I felt Tom's presence in the pastor's grip, as if his faith had reached across the years. We sat together for a while. He asked about Tom, and I told him of the nights we had fought through storms, of the roses we planted on our anniversary, of the way Tom always kissed my hand when he was worried. Pastor Miller listened, nodding, slowly reminding me that faith was not about avoiding storms, but surviving them. He said truth has its own rhythm, sometimes slow, but it always arrives. When he finally stood to leave, he placed one hand on my shoulder, steady and strong. "You are walking in that rhythm now, Eve. Do not forget that." After he left, the room felt both emptier and fuller at the same time. I sat in the silence for a long moment, then turned back to my laptop. A new message had arrived. Megan again, this time longer. She outlined the next steps in detail. She had already filed an emergency notice with the probate court to freeze all estate distributions. Drew would be barred from accessing any accounts tied to Tom's name. The house could not be refinanced or sold without my written consent. She explained that Alaska law recognized one-party consent for recordings, making the audio not only usable, but powerful. The supplemental will notarized and witnessed carried even more weight. "We will call for a family meeting by the end of the week," she wrote. "I will be there with you. Bring the documents and the recording. This will not be a conversation. It will be disclosure, formal and binding." My eyes blurred as I read her final line. "You are no longer at their mercy. The law is on your side." I closed the laptop slowly, my pulse steady, my breath deep. Outside the window, the snow had stopped, the night sky clearing to reveal sharp stars over Anchorage. Their cold light pressed against the glass, and I pressed my palm to meet it. Across town, I imagined Drew and Lena still celebrating, perhaps posting more photos of their new curtains, their gleaming kitchen, their wine glasses raised. They were so sure of their victory, so blinded by arrogance, that they could not see the ground shifting beneath them. They believed forever was theirs to claim. I whispered into the quiet, my breath fogging the window. Forever is not decided by paint or laughter. Forever is decided by truth. The heater rattled and fell silent. The room was still the only sound, the beating of my own heart, stronger now than it had been in years. Tomorrow the fight would begin in earnest. Tonight, I allowed myself one moment of peace, knowing the freeze was already in place, knowing that Tom's protections had come alive at last. I turned off the lamp, slid under the thin blanket, and closed my eyes. The silence did not crush me anymore. It carried me. 31 days crept by like slow-moving clouds over the Chugach Mountains. Each morning, I drew a small line through another square on the calendar pinned above the desk in my motel room. The rhythm of waiting became its own kind of prayer. I drank coffee in silence, walked short stretches of icy sidewalks, reread Tom's letter at night. The freeze Megan filed gave me a strange sense of calm, but I knew the silence would not last forever. Something larger was approaching, and I could feel it pressing at the edges of every hour. The phone call came on a gray morning when the motel walls felt closer than usual. I had just returned from the laundromat folding a stack of warm towels when the phone buzzed across the table. Drew's name appeared, his number glowing like an old wound reopening. My first instinct was to let it ring, to sit in silence as I had for weeks. But I pressed answer, holding the phone steady in my hand. His voice crashed through the line, ragged and desperate. "Mom, please, you have to help us. We just got this letter." My hands stilled on the towel. What letter, I asked, though I already knew. A sound of papers rustling filled the line. He spoke quickly, panic dripping from every syllable. It says, "Default notice, breach of contract, foreclosure proceedings if payment isn't made in 15 days. His voice cracked. "They're going to take the house. Tell me this isn't real." I could picture it as if I were standing in their kitchen. The glossy white cabinets, the new gold fixtures Lena had chosen, the marble counters gleaming under harsh light. And on that counter, a plain white envelope with the bank's logo, its contents spread open on the table. Across the top of the letter in thick red print was one word that sliced through their illusions. Foreclosure. Drew's voice grew smaller. "Did you stop the payments, Mom? Did you do this?" I breathed in, slowly steadying myself against the tide of his fear. My voice came calm, almost quiet. "You told me it wasn't my home, Drew. Now the bank agrees with me." The silence on the line stretched so long I could hear his uneven breathing. At last he stammered, "I didn't mean it, Mom. It was the funeral. I wasn't thinking. Lena wasn't thinking. You know me. We'd never truly push you out." Images flashed in my mind. The sting of his hand against my cheek. Lena's smirk in the dim church light. The words "forever home" whispered as though I were already gone. I spoke slowly, each word measured. "You meant it enough to change the locks. You meant it enough to invite friends into my kitchen and call it yours." He broke then, sobs rough and unguarded, spilling through the phone. "Please just talk to the bank. Restart the payments. We'll cover it all, I promise. Don't let them take it. We can make it right." I closed my eyes. The part of me that had once leapt to protect him, to fix his mistakes, stirred faintly, but I held it down. My tone stayed steady. "No, Drew, I cannot." On the other end came the sound of defeat. His breath hitched a sharp sob, and then the line went dead. I set the phone down gently, staring at it for a long moment before turning to the window. Snow was falling again, soft flakes drifting across the parking lot, covering the gray in a hush of white. I watched until my chest eased. For the first time in months, I felt not like a woman discarded, but like one standing firmly on her own ground. Later that evening, another message arrived, this time from Emily. Her note was simple. "Mrs. Carter, you should see this." She sent a link to Lena's profile. My hands tightened as I tapped it open. Where once there had been bright photos of chandeliers and wine nights, there was now only emptiness. The album titled Forever Home was gone. The captions boasting of new beginnings had vanished. The clip of Drew opening champagne, Lena posing in front of repainted walls, the remodel celebrations all erased in silence. I stared at the blank page, my heart steady. It was not triumph that filled me, nor revenge. It was something quieter, more final. A line drawn, a curtain falling. They had boasted of forever, and in 31 days forever had unraveled into nothing. I sat at the small desk, pulling Tom's letter from the folder again. The paper trembled in my hands, but my eyes were clear. "You are not powerless." His words echoed louder now than when I first read them. Across town, Drew and Lena were facing the truth in the language of a banks and courts, the kind of truth that could not be deleted with a click or smoothed over with paint. I folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into the folder, and leaned back in the chair. The heater hummed low in the background, filling the silence with its rhythm. For years I had feared silence, had thought it meant abandonment. Now I understood it differently. Silence was not absence. Silence was preparation. That night I lay in the narrow motel bed, pulling the blanket to my chin. My phone sat on the nightstand, its screen dark, the line to my son severed once more. But I did not feel hollow. I felt carved into something stronger, something unshakable. Somewhere across Anchorage, the kitchen lights in my old house glared against marble counters, reflecting off the foreclosure letter lying like a wound. Lena's fingers likely shook as she deleted the last of her posts, her forever home crumbling before her eyes. Drew's head likely bowed under the weight of a reality he never expected. And I in my small room breathed steady, carrying Tom's words like a lantern through the dark. Forever was never theirs to claim. Forever was mine to protect. The family gathered on a cold Saturday afternoon at Aunt Ruth's house on the south side of Anchorage. Her living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and wood smoke, a place that had held decades of holiday meals and quiet Sunday evenings. Today the air was different, tense, heavy. The cousins whispered among themselves, uncles shifted in their seats, and Ruth herself at 70 sat upright in her armchair with a firmness that reminded me of Tom's mother years ago. I walked in with Megan at my side, her leather bag tucked under her arm, her eyes sharp and steady. I carried my tote, its weight familiar now with the documents inside. No one rose to greet me, but every eye followed as I crossed the carpet and sat near the center table. Drew and Lena were already there, seated close together, their faces pale and drawn. Drew's tie was crooked, his shoulders slumped. Lena's lips pressed thin, her eyes darting to every corner of the room but mine. Megan began without hesitation. She placed the supplemental will on the table, her voice clear. This document, signed and notarized in October 2020, contains a clause specific to the estate of Thomas Carter. Clause 17B. She looked directly at Drew. In the event that Andrew Carter verbally abuses, physically harms, or attempts to evict his mother, Evelyn Carter, he forfeits all inheritance rights to the estate. Gasps rose from the cousins. Aunt Ruth leaned forward, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. Meg continued, her tone steady as stone. "We also have audio evidence. With your permission, Mrs. Carter." I nodded, my heart pounding but my face calm. She placed the small recorder on the table, pressed play. The room filled with the echo of that terrible day. Drew's voice rang out harsh and unrecognizable. "This isn't your home anymore. Get out." The slap followed, sharp enough to make one cousin flinch. Then Lena's voice, cold and smug. "Finally our forever home." Silence fell like a weight. No one breathed. The recording clicked off, leaving only the hum of Ruth's old heater. She looked at Drew, her eyes wide with grief and disbelief. "How could you do this to your own mother?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Drew's face crumpled. He lowered his head, words tumbling out. "I wasn't thinking, Aunt Ruth. It was the funeral. I was angry. I was broken. I didn't mean it." He turned to me, tears shining. "Mom, please, I'm sorry. I don't want to lose everything." Lena shifted in her seat, her chin lifting, her words sharp. "This is being twisted. We were grieving. It was out of context." She looked around the room, searching for allies, but no one met her gaze. Megan's voice cut through. "You called it your forever home, but legally it was never yours." She tapped the will on the table. Every page, every clause, every signature affirms that this estate belongs under the custody of Mrs. Carter. I rose slowly, my knees stiff but my back straight. The eyes of the room turned toward me. I let the silence stretch a moment before speaking. For years I kept quiet, thinking silence kept peace. But silence does not mean surrender. I looked at Drew, then at Lena, then at the family who had watched from a distance. I am not here to keep walls of wood and brick. I am here to keep peace. From my tote, I drew the final set of papers and placed them on the table. My voice held steady. "I have decided to sell the house. It will not be yours, Drew. It will not be mine either. The deed has been transferred to Silver Haven Foundation. They will convert it into a home for senior women who have been displaced. Women like me." The room erupted in murmurs. Ruth covered her mouth, her eyes shining with both sorrow and respect. Drew looked as though the ground had opened beneath him. His voice cracked. "You sold it. To strangers." I met his gaze unflinching. "I sold it to protect what mattered. To end the fight before it rotted us all. That house was built with sacrifice. It will not be destroyed by arrogance." Lena tried to speak, her face flushed. "You could have given us a chance. We would have made it right." I shook my head. "You had your chance when you locked the door behind me." The cousins fell silent, the aunts whispered, but I did not hear them. My heart beat calm and steady. Tom's letter lay in my purse, his words echoing still. "You are not powerless." I turned to Megan, who gathered the documents with practiced hands. The legal part was done. The truth had been spoken. The house was no longer a battlefield. I looked once more at Drew. His shoulders slumped, his hands limp in his lap. I did not feel triumph. I felt closure. I spoke quietly but firmly. "I do not hold walls. I hold peace, and now I choose to live in it." I gathered my tote, the papers secured within, and walked toward the door. The murmurs behind me faded into the steady sound of my own footsteps. When I stepped out into the cold evening, the air bit at my cheeks, but my chest was warm. For the first time in years, I had spoken, not to ask, not to beg, but to stand. And standing, I felt unshakable. The next morning, Megan drove me downtown to the title office, a squat brick building with a faded flag flapping in the cold Anchorage wind. Inside the conference room, the air smelled of paper and stale coffee. Across the table sat a woman from Silver Haven Foundation, her gray hair pulled neatly back, her briefcase open to neat stacks of forms. She spoke gently about their mission, about offering shelter for older women who had nowhere else to go, women who had lost homes or been pushed aside by family. Her words slid into me like warm water after months of cold. I signed each page, my name moving in steady strokes. With every signature, the ranch I had protected for decades slipped into a future I could believe in. When the last document was signed, the foundation representative clasped my hand and said softly, "Thank you. You turned pain into protection." Megan closed her folder with a decisive snap and nodded at me, pride flashing in her eyes. By the time we left the office, the snow had started again, soft flakes coating the windshield. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the city blur past, knowing the house no longer belonged to Drew or to me. It belonged to purpose. Word spread quickly in turn again. By the weekend, neighbors were whispering. Jack Wilson stopped me outside the grocery store, his voice low. "People are asking questions, Eve, but I told them what Silver Haven does." He smiled faintly. "Most of them looked ashamed they hadn't thought of you sooner." On the 5th day, a moving truck rumbled down Sycamore Street and parked in front of the house. Emily texted me from her porch. "They're packing everything," she wrote. I pictured strangers carrying out the cream-colored sectional Lena had boasted about, the chandelier wrapped in blankets, the marble-topped table Drew had bragged about online. By evening, the truck was gone, the porch light switched off. The next morning, a notice from Silver Haven was taped to the front door property under new ownership. "Contact for donations below." I walked past, once keeping my distance, on the opposite sidewalk. The blinds were shut, the driveway bare. Someone had left a box of canned food on the porch with a handwritten note tucked inside. "For the women who will come here." The scrawled words blurred in my vision, but I kept walking until the cold steadied me again. The neighborhood shifted around the absence. Where there had once been posted photos of wine glasses and hashtags, there was now only silence. Mrs. Harkins avoided eye contact with Lena at the market. The couple who had clinked glasses in the remodeled kitchen returned borrowed dishes without speaking. People knew. They always know when pride has cracked. Silver Haven wasted no time. Within weeks, workers were measuring doorways and unloading lumber for a ramp. They carried boxes of tile in warm earth tones, the kind that softened light. The site coordinator, a kind man with sunburned cheeks, told me they would keep the roses by the fence. He said the garden should welcome, not vanish. I nodded, feeling Tom's presence in the decision. Donations began arriving, trickling first, then steady. Quilts folded carefully in bags, coats on hangers, crock pots, sets of dishes. A woman I had never met stopped in the driveway one afternoon as volunteers unloaded boxes. She held 2 brand new pillows tags still attached. Her voice caught as she explained her mother had been left without a safe place in her final years. "Maybe these will help someone rest," she said. I could only nod, the lump in my throat too heavy for words. By early spring, Drew and Lena were gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye. Jack told me he watched them drive away in silence, the car heavy with boxes but light on dignity. He said Lena stared straight ahead while Drew's hands gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles shone white. After that, neighbors began talking more freely. They whispered about the slap, about the posts that had disappeared, about how quickly forever had unraveled. I listened but did not add my voice. The story spoke for itself. In May, a letter arrived at the motel. The envelope was creased and the handwriting uneven. I held it a long time before opening. Inside was Drew's voice in ink. He wrote about counseling sessions, about debt management classes, about trying to untangle the mess he had made. He wrote that he did not expect me to forgive him, but hoped I would know he was trying. He apologized for the slap, for the words, for believing the lie that a house mattered more than the woman who built it. I read it once, then again, hearing both the boy who once drew me crayon hearts and the man who had turned those hands against me. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Tom's. I did not reply. Boundaries are the bones of peace. Forgiveness might grow someday, but it would not erase the truth. By summer, the house had become something new. Silver Haven sent a small newsletter with a photo of the porch flower boxes blooming with early roses. The caption read, "A safe landing for new beginnings." No faces were shown, only the shadow of women carrying bags through the doorway, the curve of a cane leaning against the rail. I stared at the picture until my vision blurred. One evening, I walked past again the sky holding the long light of June. Through an open window, I heard the soft hum of conversation and the clink of mugs. No laughter of arrogance, no voices claiming forever. Just the sound of women settling into safety. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing the scent of roses rising in the warm air, and let the sound wash over me. Karma had not arrived like thunder. It had come quiet, steady, like snow falling until the world was covered. Drew and Lena lost the home they claimed, the reputation they polished, the pride they clung to. I lost the house I had built, but I found something harder to steal. Peace. When I returned to the motel that night, I opened the drawer and looked at Drew's letter one last time before closing it again. The silence around me was not emptiness anymore. It was full. When spring melted fully into summer, I left the motel behind and drove north along the Glen Highway until the mountains opened and the air smelled sharper, cleaner. Nestled near the edge of Lake Knik stood a cabin for sale, small and weathered, but steady. Its cedar siding had grayed with years, the porch slanted a little, but the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt my chest loosen. The lake stretched wide in front, still as glass, reflecting sky and forest like a promise. I knew before I turned the key that this was where I would begin again. The cabin held only one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight, slanting through lace curtains left by someone before me. I walked the creaking floorboards, slowly laying my palm against the walls, as if greeting an old friend. This was not exile. This was sanctuary. I moved in quietly, carrying boxes from the car with only what mattered. Tom's photograph framed in plain wood, his eyes smiling at me the way they once had when we planted roses together. The crocheted blanket I had finished during his last winter stitches, tight with love and worry. The manila folder holding every document that had saved me. And the old recorder scratched at the edges, silent now, but heavy with the past. Each object found its place. The photo on the table by the window. The blanket folded at the foot of the bed. The recorder on the shelf above the fireplace, a guardian of my new peace. The first morning in the cabin, I woke before dawn. Pale light filtered through the curtains, the lake wrapped in mist that shifted like breath. I brewed coffee on the small gas stove, the aroma filling the single room, and carried the mug outside. The wood of the porch was cool beneath my bare feet. I cradled the cup and listened. No doors slamming, no locks turning, no voices raised to erase me. Only the distant call of loons and the soft rustle of birch leaves. I walked down to the shore, boots crunching on gravel, and dipped my hand in the water. It was cold, biting, even in June, but it made me feel alive. I picked up a smooth stone and slipped it in my pocket, a reminder that even what feels heavy can be carried if you choose it. Days settled into gentle rhythms. I swept the porch each morning, learned to split firewood with an old axe left in the shed, and stacked the logs neatly against the wall. I cooked simple meals, ate by the window, watching the water shift colors from silver to deep blue. At night, I lit the small lamp by the bed and read books I had not touched in years. Silence stretched through the cabin, but it was not empty. It was full of breath of memory, of possibility. Sometimes I took out Tom's letter, the one he had left for me with the supplemental will, and read it again. You are not powerless. His words had carried me through the storm, and now they guided me into calm. Other nights I played an old file on the recorder, not the slap, not the cruel words, but Tom's voice from an ordinary day. A reminder to pick up milk, a joke about the weather, a simple I love you whispered before he hung up. The sound filled the room, and for a few minutes I was not alone. Neighbors around the lake appeared slowly, each one respectful of quiet. Karen from the next cabin brought a loaf of bread, still warm, pressing it into my hands with a smile that needed no questions. Walter, an older man with a canoe, left a small pile of firewood by my porch one morning with only a note that said, "Thought you could use this." No one asked about Drew. No one asked about Lena. They accepted me as I was a woman rebuilding. That acceptance wrapped me in a comfort deeper than sympathy. By July, the wildflowers bloomed bright yellow along the shore. I gathered small bundles and set them in a glass jar beside Tom's photograph. The cabin smelled of pine coffee and flowers, a scent of life moving forward instead of circling loss. I began to sleep through the night, no longer waking to phantom footsteps or echoes of slammed doors. Sometimes Drew's letter flickered in my mind, the one I had tucked away after reading. I wondered if he still attended counseling, if he kept his promises to himself. But I did not open the drawer to check. Forgiveness might one day come, but boundaries kept me safe. My peace did not depend on his repentance. One golden evening I sat on the porch watching the lake glow under the setting sun. The water caught every shade of fire gold and crimson spreading across its surface. I lifted Tom's photograph onto my lap, held it close, and whispered the words that had sat inside me since the foreclosure. Their forever home ended with a foreclosure letter. My peace began with a cabin by the lake. I smiled not with triumph, but with release. The house of my past had become a shelter for women who needed it. My son had been left to face his choices, and I at last had found stillness. If you are listening now, if you have ever been dismissed, if you have ever lost what you thought was everything, hear me. Silence can be power. It is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is the soil where strength grows, and when the time comes, you will know how to speak. So, I leave you with this question as the lake reflects the fading light, and I sit here with coffee warming my hands. What would you do if the boundary of forgiveness belonged only to you? Share your story. Speak it aloud. You are not alone.